Hi, my name is Pamela Coons, Associate Professor of Medicine in the Division of Oncology at Yale School of Medicine and Yale Cancer Center. I'm excited to announce ASCO's new open access journal, JCO Oncology Advances. As the inaugural editor-in-chief, I hope to support JCO Oncology Advances to become the premier platform to bridge the gap between accessible scientific research and clinical care. Stay tuned for more information, including new article types, at ascopubs.org/JCO Oncology Advances. We look forward to seeing your submissions in spring of 2024.
Hi, I'm Pat Loehrer. I'm director of the Center for Global Oncology and Health Equity here at Indiana University.
And hello, my name is David Johnson. I'm at UT Southwestern in Dallas, Texas. Pat, we've got a great guest today. Very excited about the interview.
Yeah, it's very timely too. I think it's terrific. Before we go on to that, though, any recent books that you've read that you want to recommend?
Yeah, actually I do. It's somewhat related to our topic today, but I just finished a book entitled Presumed Guilty by Erwin Chemerinsky, who's the dean of the law school at the University of California, Berkeley. It actually was recommended to me by a lawyer friend. I think most of our audience knows the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments to the Constitution are the ones that provide protection for people accused of crimes. And I think most of us are familiar with the Warren Court from the 50s and 60s that seemed to be a very quote-unquote liberal court that provided many of the protections that you see on the TV shows, police TV shows today, including the Miranda protections. But as Chemerinsky points out in his book, that really is a historical aberration that the Supreme Court from its founding really right through today has been on the opposite side of the fence in terms of protection to the accused. And many landmark rulings over the last several years, including Terry versus Ohio and City of Los Angeles versus Lyons, have actually provided protection and sanctioned stop and frisk activities, limited suits against police departments to institute reform, and even provided some benefit for the use of so-called lethal chokeholds. So all of that, I think, in light of what's happened over the last several months, really provided some insight, to me at least, about how the Supreme Court looks at protection of the accused. I thought it was a very interesting book to read, and Chemerinsky does a great job of explaining these landmark cases in a way that a simpleton like myself can understand them. So I recommend it to you. I think you'd enjoy it.
Yeah, book into that is that book, Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to read that. It is an outstanding read. They made a movie out of it, but if you get a chance to read the book, it's really terrific. And it again talks a lot about the inequities in terms of how our court systems have prosecuted the people of color for minor crimes compared to people that are in the majority here. And so, but I think both of those would be great reads.
Yeah, I haven't read it, but I will.
Yeah, it's terrific. Yeah, go for it. Go ahead and get started. It's our great pleasure to have Mr. Paul Goldberg join us today. Paul is, for anyone in oncology, he is, everyone knows him. He is the editor of the Cancer Letter. Interestingly, he was born in Moscow and emigrated here to the United States at the age of 14, where he went to Virginia. He got his undergraduate degree at Duke in economics. And shortly thereafter, then he worked in a newspaper in Reston, Virginia, where he met his future wife. I think from there, they went to the Wichita Eagle in Kansas. His wife was actually the daughter of the founder of what was to become the Cancer Letter, Jerry Boyd. He rose to the associate editor and finally editor in 1994 and publisher and editor about a decade ago. The Cancer Letter is the go-to newspaper for us in oncology. Over 200 institutions subscribe. There's not a cancer center director in the country that does not look for it every week. One is to see if it's in there. You hope it isn't. And then if it is, you hope that there's really some platitudes in there about how wonderful you are. And then you can go ahead and read the rest of the article. The New York Times once said that everybody who's anybody in the cancer field reads this newsletter. He's won a number of awards, including the Washington, D.C. professional chapter of the Society of Professional Dermatologists and some Gerald Loeb's Award. His investigative work has uncovered some extraordinary events, including the Duke scandal with the genomics, the ImClone scandal, as well as some of the workings of CPRID and MD Anderson. And I think he is really a flashlight that looks in the dark corners of our world, but also is there also to cheer on some of the accomplishments in oncology. And he and Otis Brawley have written a book together, First Do No Harm. They're also doing the history of oncology together. He's a novelist, he's a nonfiction writer, and he's an extraordinary individual. And I think we're really looking forward to spending a few minutes with you here, Paul. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. This is really a pleasure to spend some time with friends.
Well, by the time this gets aired, hopefully the crisis in Ukraine will be over. But just last week, the Russians invaded Ukraine. And I think it's very timely to hear more about this and the fact that you grew up in Moscow in Russian. Tell us a little bit about your early life and your upbringing, your family background, and what prompted your family to immigrate here to the United States?
Well, it suddenly became possible, and it was something that my father wanted to do. So we just sort of ran as soon as we could. It was really a kind of a fascinating time that I've been chewing on for many years as a novelist. In fact, I just turned in a novel which will be published not this coming summer, but the following summer. It's called The Dissident. It's about the Soviet human rights movement, and it's set in 1976. By then I was here, actually. But it's kind of like material found me. And really, weirdly, it's also why I'm in oncology, why I'm covering oncology. But my material kind of found me when I was in college. My friend's, my drinking friend's mother, Lyudmila Alexeyeva, was one of the founders of the Moscow-Helsinki group. Interestingly, also, my first book was about the Moscow-Helsinki Watch Group, which is really the beginning of human rights monitoring, which is really it's a staple. It's the beginning of the NGOs. It's a staple of world order, is to rely on people within the country that is being written about covering themselves in a way. It's kind of like pre-social media, and then, of course, enhanced greatly by social media. That was my beginnings. But what was also interesting is that being a writer, and I really wanted to be a novelist. I did not want to write nonfiction, but the material was so good that I had to jump in. And then I also had to, like, temporarily at least, make a living doing something else. So my former father-in-law, at the time, my father-in-law, now my late former father-in-law, a terrific guy, Jerry Boyd, just hired me to do some work for him. So I started some stuff, and he used to brag that he's the only guy who's ever made money off a son-in-law.
But Paul, I would be really interested to know, where did your interest in cancer begin? Was it with the cancer letter, or had there been some interest prior to that?
Well, when I was working for the Wichita Eagle, I kind of got interested. I always gravitated towards stories about things like insurance, for example, the value of life, anything that had to do with these sort of very complicated philosophical questions. That was kind of the beginning of my interest. That's why I didn't say, oh, no, this is too wonky. I don't want to have anything to do with this. Also, like, when people lies are always interesting. There's a fair amount of that in oncology. So I was starting to find that. And just the complexity and the characters. You run into characters in oncology that you kind of wish to run into, because you can, like, have an hour-long conversation, a 2-hour-long conversation, or 3-hour-long conversation with a lot of folks, and without really getting off topic. I mean, I get a lot of criticism from the kids on my staff telling me that I'm nonlinear in my thinking, but this is, that's linear in this field. It's also, once you get into questions like ethics, that's really the fundamentals of oncology. And that's also the fundamentals of my other interest, which is human rights. It's also the artistic potential of this field is incredible. So it just kind of grew on me. But basically, it all began as a kind of a way to make up for unevenness in cash flow from writing books. And then it just became so great. If you want, I can tell you what the actual events were that made me just say, this is my field.
Yeah, I'd love to hear. Tell us.
2 early ones. One of them was the beginning of the National Breast Cancer Coalition. I was actually taking a nap at a Senate hearing. I was editing a manuscript. It was around 1992-ish. I was editing a manuscript. It got a little bit boring for me to just sort of listen to both things. And I'm just going to fall asleep. And then I hear Fran Visco's voice booming through there. I had no idea who Fran Visco was. Nobody had any idea who Fran Visco was. Giving her Men in Suits speech, which is like the beginning of kind of the patient movement in breast cancer. And I kind of woke up and I pushed the button on my tape recorder and I got it. It was just unbelievably cool. And I said, okay, so conversations are being had in the kitchens, wherever. There are these people who are talking about setting up a public movement, because there was never a public movement really of patients in oncology. For the most part, it just felt a little bit boring. I started working around the corners of oncology around 1986-ish, 5-ish, really. About 5 or 6 years later, I was writing other books, and I was bored a little bit, because there was a bunch of white guys making decisions behind closed doors. They stopped smoking a few years before, but there were still white guys behind closed doors. Suddenly, this was something completely different. This was a public movement, and I could recognize a public movement because I'd seen them. I've written about them. I've been a historian of them. So there was that. Then came about that very same time, really roughly the same time, came the NSABP scandal. The Cancer Letter was writing fairly short stories. Now, it had been around since 1973. So there's just this incredibly rigorous device for monitoring history of oncology. You can just track the thing. But it was different because Jerry didn't write 5,000 word stories. Sometimes he did, but mostly he didn't. But I can't really express myself briefly. I kind of have to go. And so I started realizing that I could just return to the story over and over and over till I understood it, until everybody else got it. So just drilling. And so I must have written 40 stories on NSABP, maybe more. I don't know over the years how many I'd written. But it just sort of said to me, hey, this is like a field that's now politicized in a way that kind of sustains journalism. Controversy is unbelievably cool in this, because here's a group of patients who are saying, we don't really care about NIH funding in this case, but we care about just funding for breast cancer, and we want to do it our way. Let's do it through DOD. That was an amazing story to cover. And then there's the story of Bernie Fisher, who's like the great man of oncology, getting kind of pulled through the ringer on this thing. And it was awesome. Then another thing started happening. I started going to the meetings of I loved ODAC. I always loved ODAC, and I still love ODAC. I haven't missed an ODAC in maybe 40 years or something. Oh, and the same goes, of course, for NCAB. So basically, here is discussion as a spectator sport. Oh, wow. I kind of got passionate about this whole thing. Like covering ODAC, like Dave Johnson's ODAC was hilarious. It was a comedy show, basically. Dave was doing some really cool stuff, really good material, not really quotable because jokes were a little long. Shilsky was hilarious on your ODAC. Raghavan was really funny on your ODAC. And then there was Sledge, who was also very, very funny. So there was this sort of a discussion of this very complicated stuff that I just started quoting this, I think I must have quoted Dave's joke. I think you learned it from your grandfather. A box turtle on top of a fence post didn't get there by accident.
That's correct.
So, it became an obsession of sorts to just follow the characters.
But by the way, Paul, we did interview Rick Pastor a short time ago, and Rick did not say that Dave was funny. I just want to let you know. There was no comment about that at all. So there's another side to the story.
Well, the funniest bit was when Derek Raghavan once asked, we need a translator here from Southern into English. What does it mean a box turtle on top of a fence post didn't get there by accident? And then I don't think Dave explained it that time, but I have to look at my story because I would just get into these digressions of these I think that was also where Rich Schultzke invented the term toxic placebo.
Yes, we had a study we had to review that showed, frankly, the placebo was actually better in some ways than the actual alleged active drug, but had a lot of side effects. So, Paul, you've been in the midst of a lot of really interesting stories. Some would say controversial ones. M-Clone, Pat mentioned earlier, the Duke scandal. Where do you get your information without divulging,
Oh, yeah. Well, some of them I can't really divulge, but some of them I can. The beauty of the internet now is that people can come up with an email address and send me stuff, and I can actually communicate with them. And I don't even have to protect my source because I have no idea who my source is. There was one of these stories you've mentioned, I'm not going to say which one, where I could just sort of dial in a question. I could just email to this person whose name could be Mickey Mouse. I mean, I think that was a Mickey Mouse. So I could just send the question to Mickey Mouse. What happened at da 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 da? I'd like to see a picture of da 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 da. And then Mickey Mouse would send me something.
This is like All the President's Men then, huh?
It's a lot like this. It's much easier because you don't have to count back or whatever and hang up. Although I've done that. It's kind of funny. Yeah, it's sometimes things show up anonymously.
Well, that concludes part one of our intriguing interview with the Cancer Letter editor, Paul Goldberg. Stay tuned for part two of this conversation, where we'll learn more about the literary works of Mr. Goldberg, who's developed these works outside of the Cancer Letter. We'll also hear about his incredibly important insight into the Russian-Ukrainian conflict and much more. Thank you to all our listeners for tuning in to Oncology, Etc. This is an ASCO education podcast where we will talk just about anything and everything. If you have an idea for a topic or a guest you'd like to see on the show, please email us at education@asco.org.
Thank you for listening to the ASCO Education Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest episodes, please click subscribe. Let us know what you think by leaving a review. For more information, visit the Comprehensive Education Center at education.asco.org.
The purpose of this podcast is to educate and to inform. This is not a substitute for professional medical care and is not intended for use in the diagnosis or treatment of individual conditions. Guests on this podcast express their own opinions, experience, and conclusions. Guest statements on the podcast do not express the opinions of ASCO. The mention of any product, service, organization, activity, or therapy should not be construed as an ASCO endorsement.